Welcome to the AgEmerge podcast, brought to you by Ag Solutions Network. Your farming challenges are unique, so your practices should be too. We're here to share emerging ideas, build connections, and provoke conversation.
Get ready to improve your soil, your crops, your livestock, and your family's livelihood. I'm your producer, Kim Chase.
And I'm your host, Monty Bottens. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for joining us. Today we welcome Conservationist Jay Fuhrer, a name I'm sure most of you recognize. Jay has dedicated his life to taking care of the soil. He credits his parents for instilling in him a land ethic that has led to decades of work and research that we all benefit from today. Jay's approach to solving the problems of soil health is, as he says, doing most of his work with a spade in a field with his clients. Oh, and don't miss this important quote. Jay says diversity is the holy grail to go after. We may need to nickname him the Indiana Jones of soil health. This is a great episode full of wisdom and practical solutions that you won't want to miss. So let's jump right in.
Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the AgEmerge podcast. I'm overjoyed to be joined by Jay Fuhrer. Jay, welcome to this episode. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm doing fine. A little cold in Bismarck this morning. It was 2 below, but we like it that way, so we're good.
And we're recording this podcast in June.
Okay.
I'm just joking.
Sounds right.
It's not that bad in North Dakota. It's a really
Close.
nice place. I've been there. It's a beautiful area. So that's just it's kind of like the people in Western Kansas when it's a 50-mile-an-hour wind. Oh, it's just breezy. It hasn't even
I understand
that. So Jay, for listeners that may not know you, just we like to everybody to start with their story. Just kind of tell us your story and your why and what's brought you to where you are today.
Well, I think my story is, I'd spent about 40 years as a conservationist with Natural Resources Conservation Service, primarily working out of Bismarck, North Dakota. And Bismarck worked well for me because I enjoyed working in Burleigh County, which is the surrounding county around Bismarck. Still has some native rangeland left in it, a little bit less each year, but still has some. And in addition to that, it's in the central part of North Dakota. So we aren't really totally in the eastern tall grass prairie region, and we are not totally in the western short grass prairie region. We're in the mid. So we have remnants of both. And so that made it a really interesting place to work. And I was interested in agriculture primarily because I received this land ethic from my parents. And they were both products of the Great Depression. And they worked and farmed through the Great Depression, left a real memorable impression on them. So I can vividly recall when I started to work for USDA in 1980, I remember talking to my dad about, I said, there's something we're looking at. And I said, it's no-till seeding with no tillage. And I thought, wow, this is going to be an interesting short conversation with my dad. And because, every acre was plowed every year. We were good at it. And he looked at me and he said, you know what the biggest problem we had with our cropping systems in the 1930s? He said, the biggest issue was, he said, the grain always came off, but he said, then it would blow out. And he said, we just lose whole fields, sheared out or seed blown right out of the ground. And he said, this no-till thing you're talking about, looking at more intensively at work, he said that might eliminate that problem. And that's all he said. And then he walked away like dads do and went back to work. And I took that as a green light and a bit of a win. And so I went ahead and moved forward on it. But it really was this land ethic of my parents, I think. And how they took such good care of all the land, whether it was in grasslands or hayland or cropland. And then we had the livestock end of it, beef cattle and hog production, some dairy. And so I think they were always scared that us kids were going to run out of work. So they always had one more project for us, which probably was a good idea. And I think that land ethic, that transfer, is really what made the difference. And then when I started working, Monty, in more of a farmer client atmosphere, I did most of my work at the end of a field with a spade and the end gate down on the pickup with the client. And that's where I did most of it. And I think initially it was so frustrating for me because I treated symptoms. And I didn't know I was treating symptoms at the time. And so I would install all these waterways in our cropland and diversions, etc., because basically the water was just running off. And I didn't really understand why. You know, if it rained an inch, we didn't necessarily get an inch in the ground, by no means. So I would spend my summers building all these waterways, and I could keep a contractor pretty busy. And there was a lot of demand for it because there was a lot of it. And we were simple crop rotations, we were full tillage, no cover on the ground, no cover crops, really no livestock integration to speak of, and no diversity. And I think that's kind of how it started. And then it was a slow evolutionary process. I'd like to say I picked up on it in 1 or 2 days and man, I was there, but that's not true. It took some time. And I would contact people that had pieces of the puzzle kind of understood, you know, whether it was Don Rykowski at ARS Morris, Minnesota on carbon, or whether it was a Dwayne Beck on cropping systems at Pure, South Dakota, all these different people, I would contact them and I would say, could you train me? Could you teach me? And to their credit, every one of them said yes. And so it was a self-education and being mentored by others, combination of these things where I started to slowly go around the corner from treating symptoms to looking at the problem. So that's just a quick synopsis of kind of how I got started. But a lot of my change was driven out of frustration. And because I knew these things were not things that happened routinely on my dad's farm, because it was run very meticulously, and not that these people weren't, but now we had progressed further and our carbon levels had dropped further, made this very difficult to hold that fragile ecosystem together. And so that was kind of the beginning of the process.
So that's an interesting point you made right there. It's kind of that slow degradation process. It's really over a generation or two. Because it happens so slowly, is it harder for people to discover that what they're doing is the cause of it? Do you think that's one of the drivers for continuing to do what Grandpa did? Is because
there isn't much doubt, Monty. I think it's unintended consequences. And we go down a road with what we perceive to be best management practices, etc. And then we find out over time that yes, some of these definitely are, but some are not able to stand alone and they need additional support in terms of functioning on an ecosystem. And for us, I'll give you a good example. In the 80s, if I would ask one of my farmer clients, let's just say it rained an inch. And so I'd ask them, how much rain did you get? Oh, you know, we got 9,500s or we got 105, you know, everything was in hundreds because it was critical. We just always so close to a drought. And after we got down the road, you know, where we changed a lot of this around, we put cover on the ground. So now we had cover, we started to get a little more diversity. We started getting the no-till systems. We started looking at, God forbid, a cover crop. because initially our thoughts were, well, they're okay for you, but they're not for us. And so we started looking at all these things, and I think that really started to change. And then when it would rain an inch or more or less, and you'd say to that same person, how much rain did you get? The answer became all of it. That's a different answer, because now we weren't letting it run off anymore.
You were just
And
lucky because that cloud hung out over your spot, your farm longer than
ah,
the neighbor. That was it. It's just because you're lucky.
amen. I understand that totally. And so it was a different scenario, because initially we were talking about saving water, saving water, saving water. That's all we talked about.
Right.
And then one day that went away, and there wasn't any more conversation on it. And we moved on.
Yeah.
But initially, these unintended consequences and growing through these things and challenging it from the viewpoint of, hey, maybe this should be different. I mean, so you start. That was always the value in the rangeland that we had in this county, because, give you an example, the rangeland would have had 100 plus species in it. And one thing I always did, Monty, when I was working with a client and we're conservation planning on his farm, I would always ask him to pick out a field, a representative field. Don't give me your worst, don't give me your best, just give me a representative field. And we would work on that, and I'd monitor that field. And I would do some analysis, and I'd do some soil tests on it. And then we'd make some changes on it, and I'd come back and monitor it again. Well, when I'm doing all that, I need a reference. So I'd go to their rangeland, and I would take soil tests in there. And I would do infiltration in there. And then, you got something to compare it to right on that farm, because each farm is so unique that it's difficult to say, well, 30 miles away by Joe, he had this and you have something else. Whereas when I think each farm needs to kind of be compared to their own environment. And so what I didn't realize at the time, but those soil tests in that native rangeland just taught me so much. And so I would do that at a number of different places, and that always gave me a reference, if you will, for that farm.
Yeah. And I think this is and correct me if I'm wrong, we should have verified this ahead of time, but if I remember right, when I was up there, you had every other section was farmed versus owned by the railroad, I believe, at one time. And
At one time.
you had
At one
there
time.
was a lot, there is a lot of rangeland kind of intermixed with farmland still, but like you said, it's getting more and more broken or farmed or housed. So there is those across the road, across the fence comparisons to have there. And that
More
is
so.
a very valuable resource.
So when I was working, especially in the 80s, there was a lot of mixed operations. And that's not as prevalent as it was. Now we're much more all grain environment, and more so than we ever were. And so the interesting thing about it, just kind of give you an understanding, in the 80s and 90s, and even the early 2000s, the number one crop in North Dakota was spring wheat. Well, that's not true anymore. That all changed, in this last 10 years or even more. Now the number one crop is soybean. And wheat and corn is very prevalent. And then you're going to find canola and some wheat or malting barley. Okay. But that changed our whole environment. And it's a different scenario. None of these crops are evil, but soybean is a low carbon crop. Wheat was a high carbon crop. And so if you had a farm that grew wheat 4 or 5 years in a row on a field, you aren't really hurting too much from the viewpoint of carbon coming into your soil. There's no diversity in that, and I don't promote that, but that's different than 4 years in a row of a really low carbon crop where very little food coming in. And so you start to weigh all those things out, and that's what's really changing in our environment in Northern Plains right now.
Yeah, and as the world demands more protein, versus carbohydrates, we see that shift. A lot of if you're in the corn belt, some continuous corn is going away for corn, soybean versus maybe 2 years of corn and beans. So we're getting less carbon crops grown in general across a lot of the landscape, and that does change things. So
That does change things. And, this time around, Monty, it's going to be different this time around in agriculture with what we're moving into. And this is one of the items that shows up because, we're moving into this carbon world, right? The future of carbon. And so as we do that, you start looking at these things because I monitor carbon at the Menoken farm. And I do it twice a year on every field. I see these changes. So I'm going to give you an example. So if I look at I have a corn bean field. It's a demonstration farm, conservation demonstration farm, 10 fields. So one of them is corn bean. So I need a reference. So I have a corn bean field, static soil organic matter. I can't bump it up. Okay, it's no-till, but no-till is not enough. And so, the corn kind of moves it up a bit because it's higher carbon material, bigger root mass, all those type things. And then the bean kind of drops down again, and then it just kind of seesaws up and down. And so you're looking at a scenario where everyone wants to sequester carbon going down the road here. And sequestering it is one thing, holding on to it is another. And you need both. And you have to have a system that is capable of that, because look at what built your soils. In our scenario here, these mollisol soils, Lewis and Clark described it really well. Huge amounts of animal impact and perennial grass. Well, that's going to build a soil. It's going to move a carbon level. Okay. Now you take out those 120 species per acre and you replace it with one. Different situation. Short period of time that it's actually putting exudates in the soil. So we got some challenges.
Well, the first time I met you was actually in California. You were invited out by Dr. Jeff Mitchell, and I believe it was you and Brendan Rocky and a few other people were presenting to growers there in the Central Valley. I'd moved to Central Valley to help them adopt at that time, no-till or minimum till techniques. Later became soil health, then regenerative, and keep the circle keeps getting bigger that we get involved with moving the production paradigm. And I thought it was interesting, and I'm not sure if at that time you had if the soil health principles had been codified yet, or if they were in process. But I remember your presentation, and it was. I think you were on your way there. So talk to us a little bit about the soil health principles and how those came together. And I actually have a link on our website for our direct-to-consumer business talking about soil health principles, and it goes right to Menoken Farm where you've got it written up there. So tell us how that came to be and the importance of those.
So in my work environment, and especially with USDA, I wasn't able to, move the needle on soil health principles immediately. And so soil quality was a forerunner within NRCS with the soil scientists. Soil quality. Okay. Soil quality wasn't really defined in terms of how to install it in a cropping system or grazing system, those type of things. So it needed description. And I remembered that part that we didn't have. So then when we started looking at soil health principles, I took the initiative to describe them for the Northern Plains. And so I wrote them up and described them for the Northern Plains. And then it became kind of my template that I used when I worked with a client. And so it was that description of the principle, because I remembered in soil quality efforts, all good information, all good data, but we didn't have it described where somebody could say, oh, we're going to install this into this cropping system, this grazing system. And so got them described. And the description, I think, should always be updated periodically because it's always evolving, like you mentioned earlier, and we discover more. And so I think it was at that point that we started getting the soil health principles described, that we started to make some progress and started to get it known. So the first time I ever talked to my peers about it, I remember quite well. It was in Jamestown, North Dakota, and we had a statewide NRCS. This is just my peers, immediate peers, okay? And I had made arrangements ahead of time to get on the agenda. And management told me that if we get the real work done, we'll give you 5 minutes before lunch. And I said, I'll take it. Okay, I'll take it. And so
You were 5 minutes from not having these. Holy smokes.
5 minutes before lunch, I got up in front of my peers and started talking about principles and some description of them and how the impacts they could have, and building of a soil aggregate and whatever I could squeeze into 5 minutes. And that noon, I ate lunch alone. Nobody said anything negative. Nobody said anything positive. Nobody asked a question.
You were the only thing between them and lunch. You see, that was the problem.
I think so. I think you're right, Monty. And so that got better over time. And I think we started to understand these are dynamic soil properties that we can impact with management. And we knew that from the soil quality effort from many years earlier even. We also knew why soil quality never really got on the bus.
Yeah, it was too quantitative, if you will. Would that be the way to describe it? You know,
Yeah, not enough
numbers that
description.
we're aiming for, but not like why or how or what does that mean?
Lots of columns, lots of standard mean deviations,
You know,
and that type.
This equals soil quality index value of X.
Yep.
And it's like,
It lacked a heart.
Correct.
Yep. And it needed a beating heart, and I think the descriptions helped with that. And then people could take that and apply it to their own setting. And it's always been interesting because you go and you do a workshop somewheres, and ultimately at a quiet time, maybe it's lunch or a break or you're in the restroom or whatever, somebody will say something to you like, so I did this, this, and this. And it's kind of a quiet conversation because somebody who doesn't like to draw attention to themselves and what they're doing necessarily, but yet they want to talk to you about it. So those are great conversations, and they give you, I think, everything from some fulfillment to understanding what is and isn't working.
The AgEmerge podcast is brought to you by Ag Solutions Network. The ASN team is hands-on, digging in and invested in regenerative agriculture. Along with the proper plant nutrition and biologicals to boost your soil microbiome, we provide the ideas and implementation guidance to support you on your soil health journey. So stop farming the same way and contact Ag Solutions Network today at asn.farm.
And I think fast forward a little bit, it got picked up by NRCS and USDA in the really kind of a targeted campaign, unlocking the secrets of the soil, I believe. Right. It became popularized. Yes. I was all excited to see it. We participated, got the brochures out and those kind of things. But when they arrived, there was a misprint. Did you notice this, Jay? At first, there was only 4 soil health principles. Because somebody between Bismarck and Washington, D.C. accidentally lopped off principle number 5, which I would contend is equal to or has a greater impact than 1 through
Yes.
4 combined.
This
How
is
did
this
you
is
allow that to happen? I mean, didn't you have trademarks, patents, copyrights in this? I mean, were there attorneys involved? How did you get this? Because now, thankfully, it has it has slowly crept into the publications. Not much fanfare, but it's there. And it's even in the same text size. I mean, they haven't, put it really small, number 5, integrate.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it was initially the Soil Health Division evidently made a decision to use 4. And so we had the Soil Health Division out to the Menoken farm. And we also had the Soil Survey Division, both out of Washington. We had them to the Menoken farm. And we went through everything on the principles. And I opened up the conversation by saying, I see that you've used 4. I said, everything that's come out of North Dakota and Menoken Farm, it said Burleigh County, etc. I said, we've always used 5. And I said, the fact that you're using 4 is incorrect. And you need to look at addressing this 5th one, which you're maybe not real comfortable with. Maybe it's a bit more controversial. Maybe you feel there's more ramifications in there. Could be anything from confinement to feedlot to whatever. But I said we need to get a ruminant back on the land as much as we possibly can, because it's a huge part. It usually doesn't start out as the number 1 principle that somebody installs. They usually start out with the others, but ultimately it becomes the most important principle. And so it's a huge item in soil regeneration. And so to their credit, I think they've been leaning back into it a bit more, but definitely one of the principles.
Well, I'm certainly glad you twisted their arm a little bit to not overlook that, because it is included now. It says, and where possible, integrate grazing livestock, and that is
Big step.
a,
Big step.
a big step. Now, you probably don't want to start with that, if you're, corn soybean guy or
Yeah, I get that.
wheat person and such, but that needs to at least be on your radar for the future. So,
But you bring up a good point when you say, Monty, when you say a starting point. And for me, when I would write or describe principles, I would always start with armor. I always liked the term armor because of what it represented. And we always start with that. And the reason I always start with it is because until you stabilize a field, it's really difficult to do something with it with principles in general. And so here in central part of North Dakota, it wasn't until we put cover on our cropland soils that they hydrated and changed the whole environment. And the whole evaporation, soil temperature, all these things that go along with it. And now you have a green plant. Every green plant's a carbon inlet. And so as you bring the carbon in, and now you have moisture, because all these soil functions take water.
right.
And so it's to me, armor is kind of at the beginning, and then from there move down the road.
Now, I think this was kind of your secret way, though, to make sure everybody does cover crops all the time, because of all the practices that a farmer can do, cover crops allow them to hit all 5 of the principles, because you can
It
have
can.
armor, the good
Yeah.
living root all the time. You can have the diversity definitely in a cover crop mix. You can graze it.
Yep.
I mean, you're hitting all 5 of the principles. Was this the secret message behind all this, Jay? It was just
I'd
a
like to say it
roundabout way
was,
to make that
Monty.
happen?
I'd like to say that, but that's not true.
Oh, okay.
I think I had to learn that as we went down the road, but we definitely saw that occur as you just described, because what else can you apply into a cropping system where you can click that many boxes? And it definitely has that potential to do that. The first time we looked at cover crops, I was more of the opinion, well, why would I use up my water and my nutrient and cost of seed and seeding, et cetera? Why would I do these things? It just doesn't add up. And it's really not maybe our European culture, if you will. And so we don't really have a long history of it. Look at the history in the US. We started out with tobacco as the big cash crop, and as it eroded fields, we just moved a little further west and cleared out something additional. There wasn't cover crops in there. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson talked about cover crops. But in our system, we started with the tobacco, and then eventually as a monoculture, and then we eventually went to cotton as a monoculture, and then we went to corn, again, quite a bit monoculture. And so we have a history of that more than we have a history of diversity. And so we got to kind of recognize that and know that we can make that change. And we got a number of people that have done that change.
Well, we recently recorded an episode with Gabe Brown, and
Sure.
He referenced you several times and really praised what you had taught him and the impact that you have made. So that definitely needs to be recognized there. And one of the things I was discussing with him is the hardest principles to implement. And looking at it now, because on my own farm I've integrated livestock, and while that's a lot of work, you can figure that out and make that happen. I really think one of the tougher principles to do is diversity. Where you have at least on the cash crop side, because
Yeah.
a lot of our equipment doesn't allow for multi-species harvestable crops, right? For the grain,
Right.
we're not doing a Three Sisters type approach.
Right.
And the commodity crops, while we can grow specialty crops of those kind of things, it's just a lot more time involvement, marketing, and may not have weather for the ideal situation, and it's hard to compete with those that do. Do you agree, or am I thinking of something wrong here? In your everybody that you worked with, do you think that diversity principle probably has one of the greatest impacts, but is probably one of the toughest things to accomplish?
Yeah, I think so. I think I would concur with a lot of that, because I think over time I've racked up a lot of failures in that department, and now and then you get something that works and moves forward. You mentioned Gabe Brown, and probably one of the more brilliant minds in terms of understanding a systems process, and he always had the ability to look down the road further and anticipate that step that you're not even thinking about. And so he's been very good at that in terms of direct marketing and bringing in these additional diversity crops. And when I think about those, what moves the needle on a carbon level in a cropping system? Well, it's the additional diversity, because now you got a different plant root exudate coming in. The first 4 to 8 weeks of a green plant's life, it's going to give you some sugar. And you can taste that very easily in a corn plant. And so if you dig up the root mass on a corn plant and it's less than probably, it's maybe, let's just say it hasn't tasseled yet, or maybe it's 5, 6 weeks old, and you nip off the tips, you can taste this pure sugar. And you start to understand that this is probably our direct carbon inlet in terms of more efficient, because most of the carbon in the residue, most of the carbon, the grain's going to leave us down the road, and most of the carbon in the residue is going to go to the atmosphere, and even in the root mass, the majority of that will go to the atmosphere. So what happens with the sugar? Well, it goes directly into the soil biology. And so it's a huge impact. So diversity has this holy grail that's worth going after. And then you look at it, well, how to bring it into place. Well, we've been working on a few different ways of doing that. And we can take, so just about all plants are compatible, but they aren't always compatible at the same stage. And so I'll give you an example. So we can grow a sunflower for oil production at the Menoken farm. North Dakota has oil crushing plants, and this has been a good cash crop for us over the years. I can put in the cover crops the day the sunflower goes in the field, all in one operation, and grow a nice sunflower field with an understory of cover crops. Done it in rows, we've done it solid seeding. That works. Okay, that works. I can move a carbon needle with corn, but I need to stretch out the width. And if I go to 60 or even anything more than 30, will bring me some sunlight into the center, and I can put 7, 8 species in there, and I can move a carbon needle, I can grow a corn crop, and I can integrate livestock. So that one works, but I don't put the cover crops in the day I plant the corn. Corn wants a head start. And so you start getting up to, V4, 5, 6, somewhere in that environment. We can do this. Now, when you get to something like soybean, I've had my most success planting those green into a cereal rye. And so I'll plant them green into a cereal rye because the soybean alone struggles in the carbon department. But if I bring the rye in with it, plant them into a green growing rye, harvest out my, grow out some water if I need to, or terminate the rye earlier if I'm in a drier condition, it's management. There's another aspect of bringing in the diversity and the role it'll play. Now all of a sudden, and I can graze the rye first. And so I've taken off quite a few pounds of production on grazing it first. Then we're going to plant the beans, usually soy, but pinto. We've done canola. Those work in that environment. So now it's another aspect, but it's more management. And I think you're looking, you're trying to think this system out so that the following year you can have something that works as well. And then we do the rotational perennials. So we rotate perennials through the Menoken farm as well. They're on 5-year runs, managed grazed. I don't know if you've sold yearlings lately. We sold the Menoken farm yearlings a couple weeks ago. That was an obscene amount of profit. And I was like, this is going to be an issue in the grocery store. And beef is an issue in the grocery store right now because it's as a meat protein in comparison to pork or chicken, for instance. So yeah, I would agree with you. I think that is a bit of a challenge, and we've got some people in this country that have been really innovative on how they've done it. I mean, it's just impressive, and it's not like myself or somebody else has been telling them how to do it. They figured it out in their environment by looking at the principle, and then they went ahead and found what worked in their environment.
Well, one of the things I love about you, Jay, is you're extraordinarily humble, and you teach things very well. And just to review a little bit there, what you're talking about is it's not only finding the compatible cover crop species, but it's finding the compatible planting window. So in the case of the sunflowers, you found the compatible species, which are lower story, so probably maybe cereals, spring cereals.
They're all broadleaf. They're all broadleaf with
Okay.
the sunflower, because then I still got a grass herbicide option.
Ah, I see.
So they're all broadleaves. And
or what are you looking at?
yeah, it's
brassicas,
so you got flax, and you got canola, you got phacelia, you got soybean, you got cowpea. So you got all these broadleaves.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are legume broadleaves as well.
And so then, like you said, with the corn, you're going to wider rows to get the light down there because the corn has to have the head start. So once it does get that head start, it stays ahead and it canopies. And that's a real problem we have where we're at, is a thick canopy. I've had a lot of trouble with, trying to get V5 type covers established.
I would think your environment would be really difficult because how much sunlight really comes through for you. It wouldn't be much on it if they're on 30.
Good corn crop, the goal is not much at all. So
in other words, there's none.
Yeah. So what you got to look at is if you give up a little bit on wide rows, and Bob Recker and I were just talking yesterday, just trying to figure out this wide row thing, because there's so many good things that can happen. What are the extra revenue pieces we can put together to make that happen?
Well, and my dad grew 38. It was usually referred to as 38 to 40 because there was some wide you row. could adjust his wide row. And I really think it isn't necessary even to go to 60. If you could do something less. We went to 60 because of math and the headers. I mean, that because nobody had to buy anything.
And twin row 60s, that's a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
because I think your in-row competition is a lot better early stage. But
Well,
I,
and
you know,
remember, Monty, remember the old study that was done on 8 rows beans, 8 rows corn, 8 rows bean, eight
yep,
rows
the edge
corn. This
effect
goes
and
back.
all that.
Yep, and you get in, and then they did the yield by row.
Yep,
And of course the first 2 rows that had the most sunlight, they had the greatest yield. And
right.
so really you're trying, from an ecology viewpoint, you're trying to capture some of that, I think, as well.
And then somebody invented 16-row corn heads and 50-foot platforms, you see, and just ruined all this kind of stuff. I think
Yep.
there's real hope for automation there. As we get to automated vehicles, they can be smaller in factor and size. Because, okay, let's face it, why do you have a 50-foot platform? Because there's one guy that can run it, right? You don't have like 3 people standing around at the farm looking for something to do.
Waiting.
So
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
just equipment's got big because people have gotten fewer. So
Yep.
I think automation allows us to have more operators with which will allow us to get the smaller form factors. But back to what I was saying, just looking at the mixture that you're planting with it and the timing of it, and really in the soybean instance, rye ahead of the planting of the soybeans, that's a no-brainer. I mean, that's weed control, that is erosion
Oh,
control, that is actually stimulates the bean yield. That's about as good as you can get.
and also, in the spring, if so, I got 10 no-till fields, but if they're green, I got earthworms actively up close to the surface in those. If they're brown, I got some worms, but not nearly as many because they got less food, right? There's less food.
There's a problem though, Jay. I find as you continue to give them more and more residues to eat and more cover crops to eat, them suckers get to be more and more of them, and they just eat the ground bare. They are
Yeah,
hard
they,
to
they,
keep
they
fed.
tell all their friends. They tell all their
Wow.
friends because they're able to communicate.
Uh,
And you raise a good point. So all of a sudden, the CN ratio of your soil, is getting quite low, quite close to what the soil is, which is about 10 to 1. So carbon to nitrogen ratio, and so all of a sudden you're at about the 10 to 1, meaning you probably have virtually very little litter on the surface at that point.
and
And so, yeah.
do you think you're part of the cause of the Mississippi River levels being so low because you've improved soil health so much and the worms so much, infiltration rates so much that there's just no runoff anymore? Do you think that's what's
Monty,
driving
the
it?
only thing I'm really sure about in life is I'm always innocent. That's really the only thing I'm sure about. After that, it's pretty tough to say.
All right. Well, we've talked about it a lot. I want you to give a little more details of the background of the Menoken farm. It's a neat thing. Robin and I came to visit you in August of 2016, I believe, and you made me drive. You put me to work. You gave me a shovel and you gave me some infiltration rings and said, "Here, go do this, and I'll watch you dig. I'll watch you drive these in the ground, and then I'll teach you how this works." So it's a hands-on learning experience. I got out of the garden before I had to pull weeds, so that was good.
That
But
helped.
now tell us about Menoken Farm, how that came
Yep.
about, and what it's
Yep.
evolved into, and how it could be a model for people in other parts of the country to
Yep.
do with the public producer partnership.
So through the Burley Soil District, I was the district conservationist there from NRCS, and I was there forever. And I was very rooted in with my clientele and just all the partnerships. And we always had this. I shouldn't say always, but 10 years before the Menoken farm, we had a little 5-acre plot, and it was on a farmer's CRP field. And we had signed an agreement with the farmer and FSA that we could use this as a 5-acre plot, as long as we maintained a 50-point cover and all the requirements of CRP at that time. So we had that. And that's actually the plot that we had our big aha moments on with cover crops. And so we had grown our first combinations on that 5-acre plot, which became the Menoken farm down the road. And so we learned about cover crops. We also had all of the perennial grasses and perennial legumes and different covers. And it was our learning environment. That 5 acres worked well. And the board, and Dave was on the board at that time, and they were very interested in expanding this. And so expanding to me meant 40 acres. Okay, we're going to go jump up way to 40. And at the board meeting, the board said, well, we're not going to bid against another farmer. So we need to look for something that's been for sale quite some time. No one's buying. It's got a big sign on it that says for sale, but nobody's bought there for quite some time. And so eventually they found that close to Menoken, which is the first exit east of Bismarck. And I liked the term Menoken. I lobbied hard to have it be named Menoken Farm, because in the Native American language, Menoken means you reap what you sow. That only fit, that fit. And then we were right there at the Menoken exit. And so consequently, it went from 5 acres to approximately 150 acres. And a little bigger than I was envisioning, but it was exciting. And so we had been at this for a while, had saved a few dollars, dedicated toward this. And then in addition to that, one of the local banks was willing to loan us the difference and set up a payment plan for us, and which they did. And so when this particular item came on the table, I still remember on the agenda, I looked at the time, and then I looked at the time.
5 minutes before lunch.
No, but the interesting thing was the conversation was less than 5 minutes before the motion was made.
Wow.
Because we had already worked through all of this, and everybody was on board. It checked all the boxes we had been talking about. It was intended to be a demonstration farm. And you know, when Hugh Hammond Bennett started, you know, there were demonstration farms across the nation. And they only lasted a few years, really, because they were deemed to be ineffective. And then legislation got passed through Roosevelt for soil districts. And soil districts became the go-to for local information. Okay. And so really what the Menoken Farm kind of became was a combination of the two. And so it goes back to the old concept of a conservation demonstration farm, which I'd like to say is a brand new concept that I thought of, but that's not true. This was on the table many years ago and didn't play out. And then now we're combining it with a local soil district as its owner, etc. And so consequently it got purchased, and then we started the whole process. You know, there was a lot to all this, setting up a building. So, you know, we had 2.5 acres in Bismarck right next to Walmart. So we sold that by the square foot, allowed us then to put some buildings up, keep our loan amount down. North Dakota, Monty, and we may be visited about this when you were out, but one of the few states that there's a mill levy for soil conservation districts in state law. And so they can assess up to 2.5 mills on taxable valuation within their county. So it gives you some foundation to work with there also. And then, you know, we sold our property, buildings, the bank, the loan, away we went, never looked back. And I would say we average, and this is conservative now, we average 30 to 35 groups a summer. So that many working days where you actually have people there that you're going to present some information to. And there's many times it goes beyond that.
And the value of what you're doing is the long-term systems research. So
yeah, I think so. You know,
earlier you got the corn soybean as your check rotation, but talk about the other plots that you have as you go there, basically from west to east to across the farm.
Yeah, so you know, you're looking at a situation where if I look at all 10 of these fields, and did this not too long ago, when we started, we got together with Ag Research Service at Mandan and the soil scientists within NRCS, and we did the full soils workup to the 4-foot level. Did that in 09. Did that again in 20. You know, 11 years later, we did it again, and many of the same people were still in that group, which was kind of interesting. And now you're looking at a scenario where you start comparing that and you start laying over your cropping system and you start to see these changes. So I'm doing this the other day because when you're a man my age, and you get a chance to put some numbers on a graph and eventually draw a line through them, I mean, that's a pretty exciting day for me. And so consequently, I'm looking at this and one of the fields jumps out at me because I'll give you an example. Some of these fields from 09 to 20 did not gain in carbon. Some lost, some stayed the same, some gained significantly because every one of them had a different scheme on it, which was a lot of the value in long-term soil monitoring. And so now I'm looking at this one that had this big gain. Well, why? So then I took a look at the cropping scheme. Well, the first thing that jumped out at me, it had the most animal days over that 11 years. It had the most animal impact. Okay, I wasn't totally surprised by that, but it's good to get it reaffirmed. The other thing that jumped out at it, it had the most plant diversity over the entire 11-year period. And so does diversity make a difference and animal impact make a difference? It moved the carbon needle. Okay. The other thing was some of the reason I moved into the 60-inch corn with the covers was because the carbon needle got moved a lot when it was 30-inch corn for grain, followed by a cover crop combination that was managed graze the next year. Big impacts on the carbon between those two. Well, instead of over 2-year period, let's put them into one. Now that synergism, that old analogy of 1 + 1 is no longer 2, started to come out. So that was why we got pretty interested in the 60-inch corn with covers, because we could accelerate this biologically. Yeah, just, and then we got the perennials, and the perennials will move you to neutral pH in that environment if you allow them to. And the soil biology likes that system. That's generally a nice uptick in carbon. pH is neutral. Carbon in the soil is strong. Then I've got some all no-till fields. I had one that was 11 years of spring wheat with no cover crop, static soil organic matter. 11 years, no change. And so then I had some that I lost, and I had a lot of crops like canola, yellow pea, food grade pea that we can sell locally here, goes to the Asian market, etc. Flax, lower carbon crops in there really showed out. I mean, Dwayne Beckett Pier taught me that many years ago, and I'm looking at this going, yes, I hear your voice echoing, and you are correct. That's exactly what played out. And then you find out that the low carbon fields are not very soil resistant. They're not very stable in terms of drought. So you get a dry year. Also, they collapse, and so your soil structure starts to collapse. And when you look at that, you'll find platiness. When you put the spade in the ground, when you put the spade in the ground, there's no place to hide. That's like turning your cards face up on a game. And so you start looking at those scenarios. So we started to put all this together. Now we're moving into this new emphasis on the future of carbon and everything from carbon agreements and everything that's on the table. And there's a lot of discussion on how we're going to sequester this carbon. Very difficult for some of our cropping systems to do that. They're just not made for that. And so that means changes. It means going back to the principles and looking at how am I going to do this? So all that's on the table, and the Menoken farm is a great learning environment for the groups that come, and we can stand in those fields and then talk about their history. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And every summer I know you have a large open house, I believe, and then
We do.
host groups on a regular basis. So we'll have in the notes about how to connect with Menoken Farm.
Sure.
where people can participate in that. It's everyone listening to this in the United States, you need to make a trip there. It's worth it. It's worth it to really see thinking long term and those kind of things. And what you've done is going to help answer those questions, like you said. What are practices that are using the principles to sequester the carbon, and diversity and critters or perennials are what are at the top of the list. Well, that leads me right in. My next question for you was, what are some of the biggest things you've learned? I think that's some of them, but I'm sure there's some other big things you've learned out there too. Let me ask you this, because you haven't talked infiltration rates much.
Okay.
What's the widest variance in infiltration rates from probably, I would say, maybe your worst crop would be where you've had a lot of broadleaves in there, to your maybe perennials? What's the difference in infiltration rate
okay.
from maximum to
Yep.
least?
Fair enough. So for an inch of water, and usually I set up, if I'm going to record it, I'll set up 5 canisters and get an inch of water in each, and we'll do the timing on it. And if I'm in hayland that gets winter fed back on, so nothing gets exported off, and it's already in the perennial and everything gets recycled. I've had those, they can be less than 15 seconds.
15 seconds per inch.
Yep. I'm talking the first inch now. Normally you do 2, but in one like that, I know the McPeak Ranch here in Burley County always feeds on their hayland. Okay. So nothing gets exported off, and different location every day of the winter. And I have a competition with them on infiltration. And I've been getting my behind kicked, and because they're really good at it. Now, the same scenario,
So you're saying 15 inches or 15 seconds for an inch is they're getting beat at that.
That's what theirs is, and I can't match that.
Oh.
And I've been something more than that. I've been between 15 and 30 seconds to get my inch in the water, but they can do it in 15 or less. That's fast. I normally do 2 inches.
If you extrapolate that out to 120 inches per hour, I'm sorry, but the Menoken farm is not going to survive the next Noah's flood. But
I'm worried.
For will.
So then some of the longer term ones, I've put an inch in, again, loam soil, okay, mollisol, loam soil. And after 2 hours, my thermos is empty and my patients are gone and I got other things to do, and I just call it because that water's still sitting in there.
Sounds like you're losing more to evaporation.
You would actually. And so, once your macro, if the macro pores aren't there from a taproot and the micropores aren't there from building soil aggregates on fibrous roots, when those things aren't there, you have a lot of difficulty getting water into the system. Because we knew this back in the 80s as we ran off all our water. And we can create that environment again very easily. And so it varies tremendously. I can get a lot of mine in the less than a minute, less than 30 seconds on a lot of these fields. But then if I get too many low carbon crops, then all of a sudden I'm at 2.5, or I'm at 3 minutes, something like that, which still isn't horrible, but now it's starting to show already. So it shows easily as we take carbon, which is the food. When we don't have enough food going into the system to feed the biology, to build the aggregates, it shows up in our infiltration right away.
So the difference between 30 seconds and 2 hours is how many feet?
A lot. A lot.
I mean, how far apart are those 2 sample points out there?
Oh, they were both in the same county here. They were probably just 2 farms that were 25 miles apart, both loam soils, identical soils. I did them in the same day. That's why it was so profound.
Right.
And the one that was a couple hours, we made changes. We made changes because it speaks to somebody when that water does not disappear. I always had an infiltration kit on the at my desk in my office, And whenever I had an appointment, I'd throw that infiltration kit in. Doesn't cost you anything and tells you a lot of information. So it was always good. But it all kind of goes back, Monty, to my personal goal. And my personal goal is I want to be able to farm forever. And when that's your personal goal, it's not the goal of USDA necessarily or Menoken Farm necessarily. I think you should also have a personal goal. And my personal goal has always been I want to farm forever. And if you want to farm forever, you start looking at all of this a little differently, knowing that you're going to get the right dog in the fight. And so I don't want to bring a little poodle to a big dog fight. And so you get in the fight with the right thoughts and the right tools, and then you can make a difference on that field.
Wow, my mind is blown by that. Farm forever. I want everybody who's listening here today to think that way. What's it like? How would you farm differently if you wanted to farm forever? Not just for this season, this year, or this 10 years, or just for the next generation. What would it be like to farm forever? And that's a critical mindset to adopt, isn't it?
Well, it's where I'm comfortable, and it's where I want to be, and it's where I put my efforts. And I'll be the last person to ever say, that everything that I've applied is correct. I've changed a lot of things. I failed on a lot of things. I try not to fail on them twice. And I try to learn from it and move on and revise. But that goal has been constant for me.
It's a great goal, and I hope a lot more people will adopt that, Jay.
Well, I think we have traction in this soil regeneration, soil health world that we've never had before. Mm-hmm. And there's going to be some interesting things coming down the road in this whole carbon emphasis that are going to teach us some things that we maybe kind of know now, but need to substantiate and get the right tools. I think by the time we're done with this emphasis right now, in terms of climate smart agreements or voluntary carbon credits or whatever you're looking at, I think by the time we get done with those in a few years, we'll be just about in position to move into it. Because we're going to have all these different tools that we're going to try to measure with. Mm-hmm. And I had a colleague of mine say, what would you sign, Jay, if you were going to do a carbon agreement, voluntary carbon agreement? What would you sign? I said to him very matter-of-factly, Monty, I said, want one that uses a model that shows an upward progression and they never, ever field verify it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's too variable, carbon's a challenge. Yeah. And it's so variable. It's not just a straight upward progression line. It isn't. Right. And so it's difficult. And it's difficult to hang on to it once you do have some. It's food, and that's a lot of the issue.
It's a precious resource. So
it's a precious resource, but it's part of farming forever.
Yeah, very true. Jay, anything else you'd like to bring up with our short time here together?
Well, appreciate you speaking for the resource, Monty. That means a lot to all of us, I think. And thank you for that. And I think, if we are all kind of willing to work together on this, I think we can really make a big impact. And I think we can have some desirable outcomes. And I don't think it's going to be easy. I think there'll be some challenges, but I definitely want to give a shout out to all the people that have been doing this. Some very, some like kind of like a Gabe Brown, where he's more willing to lay it right out there in the open. And there's others that's not them. They do something in a much different setting, but collectively, all of them together made a real impact.
Well, thank you, Jay, for what you've taught me personally, and certainly what you've taught the entire agricultural community, both in, professionals at NRCS and farmers, consultants, and really helping to define and paint the picture of those soil health principles and all the impact you've done from really practical research and demonstration that people can get engaged in. You just you're a real leader because you're doing everything that you possibly can with what you've been given to make the biggest impact. So
Well, I was just glad I got those 5 minutes before lunch. That was the most critical. So thank you,
Oh,
Monty.
yeah. Well, thanks, Jay. You have a wonderful day, and
Likewise.
we'll stay in touch.
Okay, take care.
Take care.
Yep, bye now.
Thanks for listening to the conversation today. What a great way to keep our minds thinking about the impact our soil practices have on soil health, and Jay's practical know-how that encourages us and gets us to the spot when asked how much rain we got, we can say all of it. Jay also says his work in this field has allowed him and others to farm forever. Now that's something to strive for this year. And as always, if you'd like to learn more about what we're doing to help growers implement soil health practices, check out our website at asn.farm. And there you can click on links to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. There's a lot of great things happening and always something to learn. Thanks for listening.